Hey, Cornerstone, thanks for joining us for week number 2 of Church at Home. I hope that you have some others with you, your family, maybe it's somebody that lives near you or somebody that is a close friend of yours, someone else part of the church. Hope you're able to share this time with somebody else around you. But if you're not, like last week, we're going to have some times that we ask you to pause the video and to reflect together on some questions. And if you're not able to be with someone today, to just grab a pen and a notepad or a piece of paper, a diary, something, journal, not diary. I don't even know if it's a thing anymore. I don't know. But you grab a notepad, something to write on, and at least for yourself, just to spend some time reflecting on the answers to the questions that we ask you. But before we get into the material for the day, there's just 3 things I want to let you know about. Number 1 is that we're praying for you. Is that we know that this season, that this journey is causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear in various people, afraid of getting sick, fear of what's going to happen to the economy. There's all sorts of different things that we could fear in the midst of this. But we want you to know that we're praying for you. That when I say we, I mean me and the rest of the leadership. That we're praying for you, and we're praying for the rest of our church. We're praying for our community, our state, our country, and the world. That the church would be stronger through this. That this would be a time that God can help us to renew our minds, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. So what we're praying for you, and number 2, we're here for you, is that we've developed a care team that if you have a need, if you just let us know, and we want to do the best we can to meet whatever that need is. Or if you know somebody that doesn't have online access, but they maybe have a DVD player, and they could benefit from this Church at Home resource, just let us know, and we can make them a DVD, and we can get that safely delivered to them. We're praying for you. We're here for you. And number 3 is we want to commune with you. I'm a preacher. We got to have those 3 points that go together. And what I mean by communion with you is we're gonna give something a shot. At 5 o'clock every Sunday is we're going to have a Facebook Live communion service. And all that means is that we ask you to just prepare some elements for communion, whether that's grape juice and some crackers, or what the Ernst family had available last week for communion was some apple juice and some Cheez-Its. Whatever works for you, as a time to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. And so what we're going to do is at 5 o'clock, you'll just log into our Facebook page, and actually we're going to share it to our group too, so you'll be able to tune in there. Is that if just set your alarm for 5 o'clock and go to our Facebook page, and I'm just going to lead us in a time of a communion meditation and a prayer, and then we're just going to together in our own separate homes, though at the same time we're going to take communion together, remembering Christ and the sacrifice that he paid for us. We hope you'll be a part of that. So if you would, just set your alarm, even now, for 5 o'clock, so we can tune in and we can participate that in unity, and we can do that together. How I want to start today, I want to start with a question. And here's the question. Where is your focus? Maybe the question really for you, first here is where's your focus even right now? It's maybe you're kind of looking at the screen, you're going, where are you, Devin? It doesn't look like the church. Where are you? And maybe your focus is, do we really have to watch this screen for this material for a few weeks ahead? Do we really have to? Maybe your focus is, Devin, why are you wearing that ugly jacket? Fair enough. We're going to get there here in just a second. But where's your focus? How about this? Let's try it this way. I'm gonna show a picture. I'm gonna put a picture there up on the screen. It's one of those when you see it pictures. Just kind of look at that. It looks just like a nice family, but there eventually you're going to see it. If you haven't seen it yet, just kind of look down on the cushions of the couch. See, when you see it, it's really rather funny. Sometimes we've got other things going on that it looks like that there's some things that just kind of consume our pictures, consumes our focus, when there's actually something happening there on the side or something there underneath the couch, if you will, that we really can't see. So here's the question I've really got is, in the midst of this pandemic, where is your focus? In the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the illness, in the midst of businesses temporarily shutting down, in the midst of us unable to gather as a church, in the midst of all the news and the headlines and all the medical updates, where is your focus? Because it can be really easy to pay attention to what seems obvious right in front of us. It can be really easy just to pay attention to the pandemic. And we can miss actually what God is doing in the background. We talked about last week. We looked at Romans chapter 8. And part of that text was seeing that God can and God will work through this, for God works good for those who love God. Now, God, that doesn't mean that God has caused the bad. It just means that God will work good even out of bad situations. But I think, as we continue in our study of Ephesians, I think we're actually going to see, call it God ordained, call it coincidence, call it whatever you want, but I think it's going to be pretty obvious to us as we go through the rest of the book of Ephesians, that in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of the chaos, that there are some things that God is doing, that there is good that God is working even right now. The question is, where is your focus? Are you seeing what God wants to do through this? Are you asking the question is, how is God working? Are you looking for where God is working? Or are we focused on the fear? Or are we focused on the chaos? Where's your focus? So here's what we're going to do. Is we're just going to pause the video here, and I just want you to either write it down or discuss with those around you. Where would you say that your focus has primarily been? Regardless of where your focus has been thus far, Paul is going to challenge us in our text from Ephesians chapter 4. He's going to challenge us to have a different focus. And this is for all times and all places, but it's especially true, I think, for us. And I think it's a way that God can be speaking to us in the midst of this, that there's a place for us to have a laser-like focus in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of this pandemic. So the text we're going to look at is Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 17, and it will actually end in chapter 5, verse 2. I just want to look first at the first a few verses. Here's what it says. With the Lord's authority, I say this. So let's just pause and say right there that he's saying something really strongly. He's urging. He's playing the God card. Here's what God says. Now, of course, we know that all of what Paul is saying here is inspired by God, but this is all the more focus for us that Paul says right here up front. He's trying to be really clear. This is big stuff. So here's how he starts. He says, with the Lord's authority, I say this. Live no longer as the Gentiles do. That is, the non-Jewish people, the ungodly is really what he's saying. With the Lord's authority, I say this. Live no longer as the Gentiles do. For they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life God gives because they have closed their minds and they've hardened their hearts against Him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. So here's the first thing that Paul's saying in this text to us. It's kind of a context, really, for what other things we're going to say is, don't live like the world. That we've got people here that Paul's saying they've completely given themselves over to the passions and the desires of worldly bodies. The only thing that they think about is satisfying their own cravings, that they only do what's right within their own mind, is how the Old Testament repeatedly refers to that. And we're not far from those same statements. And we've bought into, even the church has bought into some of these ideas like, just follow your heart. Just do whatever you feel is right. And look, I don't mean to be harsh or negative up front, but that couldn't be further from the truth. That phrase, follow your heart, is simply not true. Old Testament says the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can understand it? The actual, we're just kind of following our gut, we're just following our heart, our feelings, we're just trying to satisfy our own desires. We're really not too far from what Paul is talking about here. He's saying that the Gentiles, that they've hardened their hearts, and and that they've darkened their minds, that they follow their own desires, their own fleshly passions for so long that that's all that they can really see anymore, that there's really no good sense of right and wrong. It's so tainted. Another thing that we throw out there is just be true to yourself. No, that's not at all what Paul's going to tell us in this text. Not be true to yourself, but be true to something far bigger than ourselves. See, what the world really says, it said in the first century when Paul wrote this, it still says today, is if it feels good, it must be right. If it feels good, it must be okay. Just go with the impulse. In the midst of this pandemic, that's looked like things like hoarding. As people just begin to look out for their own self. And they forget that there's other people that need stuff too. And so they just start collecting things for themselves and forget about others. Other ways that can look, and pandemic or not, is sexual morality. It's lying to each other to look good or to get what you want. It's stealing to get what you want. Paul's going to mention that here in just a second. But here's the second question for us to pause and reflect on. If all of culture lived like this, just to satisfy our own cravings, just to satisfy our own desires, just to go with the feeling, if everybody was just living true to themselves and following their own hearts, their own desires, their own feelings, if all culture lived like that, would the world be a better place or a worse place? That's an important question, I think, for us to ask. If everybody just did what was right in their own eyes, every person, would the world be better or worse? Because there are some people out there preaching that message, that everybody should just do what's true, what's right for them, what they feel is right, just follow your heart. If everybody did that, would the world be a better place or a worse place? So I hope in your discussion, just as you've wrestled with this, that you can see that if everybody was doing what was right within their own eyes, oh man, this would be a dysfunctional place. In fact, it would look back like the days of Noah, when God saw no better way than just to kind of restart. We've got to be very careful of this danger of these half-truths that are extremely dangerous, of just be you. Yes, God has designed us intentionally. Yes, God has made us all a certain way with unique attributes and characteristics and personalities. Of course, that is true, and those are good things. But to take that so far as to say that we should just do whatever we feel is right within our own eyes is a very dangerous and destructive path to go down. Paul breaks it down a little bit more for good and bad here, and we're going to I'm going to read kind of the chunk, the most of this text here, and then we'll go back and break it down a little bit. But from verse 20 to verse 32 here, here's what it says. That isn't what you learned about Christ. What's that? He's saying, live no longer as the Gentiles do. So don't live like that anymore. He says, but that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Let's pause here for just a second, that there's something he's saying is very fundamental, very elementary about following Jesus, and that whole idea of doing what's true to ourselves and following our own passions, our own lusts, our own desires, that's our old self. That's our before Christ self. He says, but you've given that up. Throw off that old self. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Refocus. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. So stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth, for we are all parts of the same body. And don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you are still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. If you are a thief, quit stealing. Instead, use your hands for good, hard work, and then give generously to others in need. Now, there's a message for us today. Don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. And do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, He has identified you as His own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. What's he saying? He's saying refocus. He's saying refocus. Focus on Christ by the renewal of your mind. Let your mind be renewed. And by refocusing your mind, the renewing of your mind, focus again on Christ and let the Spirit renew your mind. See, I think there's an intentional act here that we have to play, and here it is. The intentional act is intentionally refocus on Christ. And when you refocus, when you fix your eyes on Jesus, it renews your mind by the power of God's Spirit. And when we all have our minds renewed, it impacts our behavior. So Paul gives us two basic things here that we are to do. The very first is this: shed off the old self. Throw it away. Get rid of it. With those cravings and those impulses, that's our old self. Throw it off. Don't act like the world. Get rid of that side of yourself. That when you're making a decision, and instead of asking, what do I want to do? What feels right to me? What is the best to be true to me? Rather than asking that, ask a different question. That the question fundamentally within us should not be, what do I want to do? What is my desire? But focus on Christ. And He will renew your mind. Throw off the old self. See, this just simply leads to selfishness. It leads to merely a thought of survival of the fittest. And this leads to what Paul said at the beginning, just pure sensuality. Just do what feels good. And then he lists some things in those verses, quite a few things, some quote, what I might call shameful mentions, things like lust and deception, lying, unresolved anger, stealing, bitterness, rage, harsh words, slander, all evil behaviors. That kind of includes a lot. See, all these things have us at the center, but Paul's urge is to take that old you, take that old self from the past, and he's saying, take it off. Rid yourself of those things. These are the things that you once were, and I love that word rid. It's like intentionally throw it off. And Paul does say, throw it off. Get rid of it. Strip those things off. So here's the question I think would be valuable for you to wrestle with, and especially if kids in the room, if you're willing to share some of these things, is maybe help them to see what was part of your old self. I don't mean don't give all your gory details or anything like that. And maybe help them see what might be a part of an old self before Christ. But what was part of your old self? And how are you tempted to sometimes try to put back on that old clothing? I get the privilege to assistant coach at one of our local high schools for the sport of tennis, and our last season it started really well, and until we met up to this team that we were outmatched, and all of our guys were getting beat out on the court, and me and our head coach were just kind of looking like, man, these guys just all of a sudden their character has changed. All of a sudden, they were so positive and up, they just excited guys. They were go-getters, and all of a sudden, they just look like they're beat out there. So the next day, as practice started, Coach called them all together, and he simply threw out this one phrase. He said this. He said, "Adversity reveals character." Adversity reveals character. I mean, our guys, at least this last year, didn't know what it was like to lose yet. And as they were facing losses, every single one of them, there was some character being revealed. And as a result, their ability went down with it. See, I think the same is true of the church, especially in the midst of things like a pandemic like this, that adversity or trials it's going to be revealing of character. So God can use all things for good. And so the question is, what is God up to? And I truly think that maybe this process God is using in the background to reveal some character within us. I'm not saying in other people, I'm saying in us. Like maybe there's something in us being revealed through this. And perhaps for you, maybe you've been really faithful and you've been bearing fruit, and that this adversity it's your time to shine. But maybe there's some others that have kind of lost sight of Christ. And this creates for you a great opportunity to refocus, because maybe as the bad news happened, maybe as this virus spread, maybe as things shut down, maybe all of a sudden you noticed that your character wasn't quite what you thought it was. That maybe this adversity is revealing some of those old sinful habits. Maybe that old sinful nature, maybe that old self is creeping back in once again. See, church, I think this is our time to shine. That the president of my Bible college released a statement. He said this, that this isn't a time to lose our heads, but it's a time to use our minds. So I think that's what Paul would tell us too. That this isn't a time for us to lose our heads. This is a time for us to use our minds and allow our minds to be renewed by the Spirit of God. So the first thing that Paul tells us in this text is to rid ourselves of that old stuff. Don't let that creep back in. But then he says the second thing, says rid yourself of your old self, of your old sinful nature. But don't forget your identity. Put on your new self. Clothe yourself with Christ. Clothe yourself. Put on that new nature that you received, the power of the Spirit, when you placed your faith in Christ. Verse 4, or chapter 4, 23 and 24, let me just read it again. Paul says, instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. Truly righteous and holy. Doing what's right and set apart, different than the world. Throw off the old self. Set your mind on Christ. So here's the thing. It is impossible to set your mind fully on Christ and stay the same. Because when you set your mind fully on Christ, the Spirit works. And it transforms us and uses us even in darkest hours. See, in the darkest hours, the church has the opportunity to shine all the brighter. So here's another question for us. How could you and your family utilize this season to set your mind on Christ? I want to explain that just a little bit. Many of us, not everybody, many of us are kind of what we're calling quarantine. That we're kind of closed off in our house, which has forced us in some good ways, and maybe some not, but in some good ways, it's forced us into some different habits. And what we could start spending our time doing is we could just kind of sit on the couch and we could veg out over TV. I'm not saying it's all bad. It's not bad to watch maybe to watch a movie here or there, or to have a little bit of entertainment as a family. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But what is it that you're really filling your mind with? Like how is it that you're utilizing this time to fix your eyes on Christ and have your mind renewed? How is the Spirit working in you and in your family? How can you intentionally utilize this change in schedule for good? To refocus, allow God to begin to just to renew your mind, fix your eyes on Christ. And because when you renew your eyes, when your mind is renewed, your behavior is going to come along with it. And we're going to have an awesome cyclical cycle here. Our behaviors reinforced, our minds renewed, our behaviors reinforced, our mind is renewed. And we can even get basic that if you're going to spend a lot of time watching TV, the question is, what is it that you're filling your mind with? Is there unwholesome talk there? I mean, we could go through a lot of these different negative things that Paul had to say. I don't really want to do that. What I'd much rather do, much rather say, is how are you utilizing this time for you and for your family? How are you utilizing that time? To set your mind on Christ, to spend some time. If you haven't already done that, maybe now just as a family or you with somebody around you, just take some time to say right now, how could you and your family utilize this season to better set your mind on Christ? Setting our minds on Christ sets the course for our behavior. And our behavior reinforces how we have set our minds on Christ. And then comes the cyclical cycle. That to set your mind on Christ is to allow the Spirit to renew your mind. And it's reinforced in the way that you live, and around we go. See, that cycle gets broken when we begin when we take our eyes off of Christ and we begin to watch out for me. When we begin to try to satisfy the cravings of our flesh and our own just desires and our own passions. Only practically speaking, that's just going to send the world in a cycle. We have a chance, church, to shine all the brighter in the midst of this, but it's got to start with us personally, of allowing God to renew our mind. Michael DeFazio gives 3 steps in his videos that I found quite helpful here. First, he says, renew your mind. And renew your mind by setting it on Christ. Second, he says, then retrain your body, which means you strip off the old self. You strip off the old habits that you once had, and you start some new ones. See, the text gives us some honorable mentions. We had some shameful mentions. Now I think this text also has some honorable mentions for us. Things like this. Tell one another the truth. Use your hands for good to share with others in need. Use your language for what is good, helpful, and encouraging. Be kind to each other. Be tender-hearted, forgiving others as Christ forgave you. Renew your mind. Retrain your body by stripping off the old self and stripping off the old habits and starting new habits. And then repeat the process. Which Michael DeFazio says, never underestimate the power of repeated obedience. Never underestimate the power of repeated obedience. Here's the last question I have for us. How might the church, by refocusing on Christ, be of significant benefit to the world amidst this pandemic? Second question, to go with that, how can you and your family be that benefit? How can you and your family be Christ to others in a practical way in the midst of all this? Let me close out our time by finishing out the text of chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Here's what Paul says, and really in conclusion here, he says, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do. Imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. Imitate God. I mean, sometimes I see that, and that is a really daunting thought. Imitate God, God who's beyond my comprehension. Earlier we've seen how even Christ's love is beyond our comprehension. We can't even fathom it, and I'm supposed to imitate that. But then he goes on and he says, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Now that's an image I can grasp. That to watch even just assess my son, for example. I do yard work and every once in a while I'll pretend like I know what I'm doing, work on a car or whatever. But no matter what it is that I'm doing, in fact, actually just the other day I was working on one of my kids' bikes, and my kids, particularly my son, wanted to be right there with me. It didn't matter if they were really being helpful in that moment or not. And what they wanted to do is they just wanted to imitate their dad because they love their dad. See, it's out of a love for the Father that we can begin to imitate that love that's first been shown to us. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. What's his example? He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. See, this is not at all, church. This is in no way a just be true to yourself message. This is a live up to this standard message. A crazy standard that we can only do by fixing our eyes on Christ and by the power of the Spirit. This is not a be true to yourself. This is a live up to Christ's standard message. Who loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us. That's our standard of love. That's why the church, in the midst of this, that we need to be wise. No question we need to be wise. We need to watch out for one another. And sometimes the best way we can do that is by isolating ourselves. But there's other times that to take a little risk and to offer and to meet a need, that's also what we need to do. But it's the Spirit that leads us in those processes. But we're not going to get those prompts until our eyes are fixed on Christ. Here's one thing that Todd and I talked about today, that we want everybody to know abundantly clear, that just because we're not gathering together, it doesn't mean that there aren't still decisions to be made. That we hope the person sitting next to you, we hope the person that you share this with, that they will take potentially the opportunity in the midst of this pandemic, that God maybe is getting our attention, to have an opportunity to respond to that very message of God's love. That like Moses, sometimes it takes God showing up in a burning bush to get his attention. That sometimes like Saul, God has to knock him off a donkey to get his attention. That maybe it just takes a spread of a virus to wake some of us up to recognize that we are frail. And that's not a scary message. That's not my point. My point is that sometimes God can use and does use bad situations for good. That maybe he forces us to refocus. Maybe he's forced us to remember our identity. Maybe he's kind of set us aside and said, look, you're kind of living like a destructive path right now, but I want to set you on a better one. You're kind of clothed in some dirty jackets. You're kind of walking down a path of destruction, and yet I want to set you on a path of holiness and righteousness. That if you have a decision to make, maybe the first time for Christ, you let us know. That our favorite part of our building at Cornerstone Christian Church is always going to be open, and that's the part that has a big tub of water, and we call it baptism. That we would love to use that. We'll use that part of the facility, no problem. We would love nothing more than this process to celebrate victories, because that's what we're all about as church. We are all about being and making better followers of Jesus. But all of us, church, we have some roles to play, that maybe God is using this to get all of our attention. We just need to refocus. We need to fix our eyes on Jesus, who wants to renew our minds and change our behavior for his glory, to be and to make better followers of Jesus. But what we've got to do is we've got to rid ourselves of our sinful nature and clothe ourselves with the identity that Christ has given us, that we are adopted sons of the King. And we've been set apart to be holy and righteous, and to be used to tell others that there's still room at the table. That's the opportunity that we have in these upcoming weeks. Will you use this time that we have? Will you use this season not to gratify self, not to hunker in fear, but to fix your eyes on Christ and to be a well-worn, used tool for his purposes? Let me pray for you. God, just as my wife and I have talked this week, that we want to use this time, not selfishly. We want to use this time, this refocused time, this time of pandemic and difficulty. We want to use this time to glorify you, to refocus our own minds, our own family, to love them well, and to love others well. God, may you be glorified through your church. That in the toughest of times throughout history, your church has shined all the brighter. And God, I pray that you would do exactly the same through Cornerstone Christian Church. God, I pray that you would give wisdom and discernment for each one listening to this, for the families that are listening to it together. That you would show them the opportunities that they have. Whether it's first refocus or whether right now they have some ideas as to how to practically be the church to their neighbor, to a coworker. Some other creative way, God, would you give that creativity? Would you give that wisdom? God, would you protect your church? Would you protect our community, state, nation, the world? Would you protect us from the spread of this virus? But God, would we utilize the opportunities that you have given us through it? All for your glory. And for the telling of your kingdom. God, you are good, and it's in you that we place our trust. We pray all this in your Son's name.